Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Barrett Johannesson and I'll be your host today. We have Jonathan Su who will be your presenter. John will be presenting on common JavaScript and form building. So if this is your first time attending these webinars, we do record these sessions, and in the next 48 hours, we will follow up with an email with the presentation as well as with the recording and any other resources that John goes through today. Next up, we always want to make sure you're aware of some upcoming events that we have. We actually have one next week, so if you're in the Herndon area or if you can get a flight to join us, I would highly suggest doing it. On Monday and Tuesday of next week, we do have certification sessions, so we have Form Builder certification as well as Data Flow certification at our Power User Summit week. And then on the 13th is the actual Power User Summit, where we have customers coming near and far to present on their solutions, as well as having some of our internal team go through some of the upcoming releases that we have and platform enhancements, and really getting a good Q&A session with our customers to make sure that what we're planning on doing is still in line with what makes you a power user. Also, with our upcoming events, we have some announcements. So beyond the Power User Summit, we also have an online Form Builder certification session. This is going to be in early October, so October 3rd through the 5th. This will be 3 days, and it'll be a total of 6 hours. So that's 10 a.m. to 12 on the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th. If you go, once you have this presentation, this is a link, and you'll be able to sign up for that certification session. Then later on in this month, on the 27th, we do have another webinar on what Zerion documents and reports are. This is a great time if you haven't been exposed to these different Zerion web services. This is a great webinar to attend and to learn a little bit more about how to leverage these platforms. And then the final webinar that we're going to speak about today is on October 10th. And this one's called 3 Forms Every Company Should Be Using. During this session, John will be going through 3 separate forms that add value to companies regardless of their industry. So something like the see something, say something type of form, and just really those generic forms that you have within your company or within every company. He'll show you what those look like and how to implement those at a larger scale. And with that, John, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you. Sorry, everyone, I jumped the gun on that one. The first poll we're going to do is we have one quick poll just to kind of see who our listeners are. So the first one is just, are you a current user? If everyone could go ahead and respond to that poll, that'll help John and myself make sure that we address some of your questions correctly and just make sure that we understand who we have listening. And this one, if everyone could go ahead and answer their level of familiarity they are with JavaScript. All right, it looks like we're getting a lot of good responses here. John, I think you'll be happy to hear we have 0 responses for what's JavaScript.
That's good.
Throughout that, the rest of the responses are actually equal.
Okay, split across the board.
Yep, you got it. And now, without further ado, I hand it back to you.
All right, thanks, Barrett. And so again, good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Su, and I will be presenting this webinar today about common JavaScript and form building. I've been trying to make a concerted effort to push the knowledge of our users and to empower you all to be able to build not just forms, but better forms, and then also understanding what you're working with. JavaScript is a programming language that you're able to utilize in your form building. It's called a client-side language, meaning that it runs on the device itself. It's not being run on the server. And JavaScript is really going to be the gateway for you to enhance your forms and really create dynamic data collection experiences. Now, with that being said, it can also be a pretty daunting hurdle. It's one of those things where imagine if you're trying to learn a new language, you say, where do I start? Right? Do I start with learning vocabulary? Do I learn grammar? Do I learn how to say certain things? What's the best way to improve on my adoption of the language? These are all questions that relate not only to a spoken language, but also to programming languages. The intention of the webinar today is to go through some common themes that you'll see in your form building. And what my hope is is to take those common themes and then tie them together so that you start to build a foundation of JavaScript almost separate from the platform. That will allow you to then be able to access external resources a little bit more proficiently. And then that should help you, again, continue your growth and your learning. We're going to be going over 5 different topics today. We're going to start by talking about some built-in variables. You'll also see these called built-in functions sometimes. I did want to make the distinction, and I'll elaborate on it a little bit later, in calling them built-in variables because, as you see down below, we are going to talk about functions as well. We're going to talk about operators, which are the symbols in JavaScript that do things. That's the easiest way to explain them. We'll discuss subforms as well. That's an area where once you start incorporating subforms into your data collection, then the JavaScript difficulty can have a bit of an increase, and I want to make sure that everyone can be as comfortable as possible with that. And then, as I alluded to earlier, we're going to end by talking about functions. I want to introduce what functions are. This is going to be very helpful for people who may be familiar working inside of smart controls, but don't really understand how everything ties together. And then we're going to end the webinar by talking about some common JavaScript functions that may be beneficial for you to use in your form building, or that maybe you already are using. So let's start with built-in variables. And what are these? Built-in variables are going to be values that you have at your disposal during your form building that you can incorporate into your forms. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are built-in variables that pertain to the user who's logged into the device. These have been around for a long time, and you're going to have access to that user's first name, last name, username, as well as email address. And we see a variety of different ways people leverage this in their data collection. One of the nice things you can do is you can pre-populate element values with these. You can also do things like set up labels to be a little bit more personal, having the label's text be directed towards that person's actual name. Now, on the right-hand side, we have some newer built-in variables that have been released very recently, and these are going to focus on the device itself. The top 2 you'll see are going to return the operating system's type, as well as the version of it. The next 2 are going to give information about the app itself, so whether it is the iForm app, iForm ES, or kiosk, and then also the version of the app. Then you're going to get information about the form, and then finally the device itself, so the device's model and then the language that's associated with it. All of these tools can be used in a creative way for you to enhance your data collection. For example, by using the device language, you'll be able to separate records out based on the area that they were collected. This will also help when it comes to having problems with certain records. You'll be able to report this information to us if you include these in your forms, and that's going to help our support team be able to assist you in the best way possible. Now, the way you would use any of these built-in variables is inside of the dynamic value, you would want to put in iFormBuilder.firstName, for example, or maybe iFormBuilder.OSType. Now, a couple things that are important. It's important to note that these are case sensitive, so that N in first name or last name has to be capitalized. The T or the V in type and version, as well as name, have to be capitalized as well. The next thing is you may wonder what all of this text means. Again, if the focus of this webinar is on JavaScript, and these are where we're going to start off with, we have to explain some of the syntax behind what we see. Now, the reason, before I get into the syntax, that I started with these built-in variables is I wanted to give us a ground. I wanted to have a foundation or something to build off of throughout the rest of the webinar. When I was organizing this, I reflected back on my time back in high school when I was actually learning Spanish, and we didn't start with vocabulary or grammar. We actually just started with simple phrases that you could use. And from there, we grew and expanded. Using these built-in variables is going to be the easiest way to expose yourself to using smart controls and using JavaScript as a result. If you haven't used these before, I would recommend starting off with the iForm Builder first name or iForm Builder username or email as a way of putting that value into your form. Now, there's 3 parts to each one of these built-in variables. It starts off with iForm Builder, then there's a dot, and then there's the actual variable's name, first name, last name, app name, OS version. We're going to go through each one of these 3 pieces independently, but I want to start off with the dot that's in between them as we transition into the second topic, which is going to be operators. So an operator is just going to be any sort of character or symbol, really, inside of JavaScript that is going to perform a particular action or has a particular responsibility. What I've done here is I've compiled a list of the most common operators that I see when we work with JavaScript, both in reviewing customers' forms as well as building my own. And I want to go through this list and talk about them. We're going to start with the second one, an accessor operator, specifically the dot. And so this is the same dot that you saw here between iFormBuilder and first name, for example, in this first line. Now what happens is iFormBuilder, you can think of that as the original structure, or you can think of it as a set of information. So it's an identifier. Within that identifier, you want to access a certain portion of it. So within the iFormBuilder object, you're going to identify or access first name. So that's what that dot notation does. You're saying within iFormBuilder, access first name. So that's the dot notation. Now some of you who have been a little bit more familiar with JavaScript may have also used this bracket as an accessor as well. So if I wanted to, instead of typing iFormBuilder, let me make this a little bit bigger, dot first name, you can actually also do this. Okay, and so both are ways of accessing a particular property inside of a larger object or a larger variable. Now there's pros and cons to each one of these. I don't want to get too deep into that for the scope of this webinar today, but just know that you have both at your disposal. Now that we've gone through the accessor operator, I want to talk about these starting at the top and working our way down. We're going to start with the assignment operator, which is just an equal sign. And this is going to be the operator that takes a value, which is on the right side, and assigns it to a variable. So for example, if I have an element with a data column name of today's date, I may want to assign it a value of 09/07/2017. This equal sign is my assignment operator, and it says take the value on the right and assign it to this variable on the left. You may use the assignment operator when it comes to writing out calculations. You may also use it when it comes to setting default values for elements. I know that when I set default values, I tend to do that. I'll use the data column name equals empty string is one of the most common ones I use. The next operator I want to go through was the concatenation operator, which is a plus sign. Now before I talk about concatenation and the plus sign specifically, know that I did not include all of the normal operators you use for arithmetic, like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. I left those off of here because I think that those are going to be pretty common. They're pretty standard. I don't think that they require a lot of explanation. But what I wanted to highlight was that the plus sign has a dual function inside of JavaScript. Normally it's used for addition, which is going to be where you take two numbers and you add them together. But what you can also do is take two strings, which is character input or text input, and concatenate them, meaning you glue them together. One of the most common uses I see this for is where you take the iFormBuilder.firstName, and we want to concatenate it or glue it together with iFormBuilder.lastName. So what this would do is, if my first name was Jonathan, and my second name, or not was, but is, and my last name is Sue, this was what you would return. Now you'll notice that I don't have any sort of a space here because the language is only going to be as good as the instructions that you give it. And what I gave it in terms of instructions was just to take the two text values and push them together completely. Now if I want to include a space here, I have to actually write in the instruction for that. So what I would want to do is take my first name and concatenate or glue it together with a space. You'll notice these quotations are here to identify the opening and closing boundaries of my string. I would then concatenate all of that with my last name. Now before I move on, Barrett, I did notice that a couple questions had popped up in the GoToWebinar. Is this anything that you would want me to go through that I could answer, or are you handling these right now?
Nope, I've got it. I think just the one thing is a lot of people are familiar with it being called built-in functions. And I know you mentioned before that you're calling them variables because you're going through functions later,
Yep.
but I just want to confirm, yes, it is the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's about it.
All right, sounds good. And yes, I can actually clarify that a little bit. The reason I'm calling them built-in variables is because the distinction in terms of the programming language is that a variable holds a value while as a function executes instructions. And so each of these are just going to hold a value such as your first name or your last name. We call them built-in functions because we have other aspects of your form building that relate a little bit more closely to functions, and then we put them all under the same name. But again, for the purposes of this webinar, since we're making the distinction between variables and functions, I wanted to be a little bit more explicit about what I called everything. So moving on down to the second set of operators, these are going to be operators that handle doing comparisons. So when you're comparing two values, you're normally going to be looking for one of two things. You're either going to be looking to see if they are equal or if they are unequal. Now, what's important to note is that if you take a step back, anytime you're doing a comparison operation, you're going to have one of two results. Your expression or your comparison is either going to be true or it's going to be false. And this is important when it comes to working with condition values, which is where we see this used most commonly, because if the condition is evaluated to false, then the element will be hidden. If the condition evaluates to true, the element will be visible. Now I want to start off at the top here with my equality operator. This is going to be a double equal sign. This is different than the assignment operator, which is my single equal sign, in that the equality operator will check to see if two values match one another. So going back here, if I have a value, if I say 9 is equal to 9, this would result in a true evaluation. Now, if I have a variable called age, and I set it to 20, and I say age is equal to 9, this would result in a false evaluation. Because age is equal to 20, 20 is not equal to 9. Now, the next thing I wanted to go through was the strict equality operator. And this is something that I think a lot of people tend to ask questions about. If you've worked with the page level JavaScript editor recently, then you'll notice that it may give you a warning if you use a double equal sign instead of a triple equal sign. The reason being the triple equal sign is a little bit more strict. It makes a more explicit comparison for equality. Right now, if I did something like variable result equals 0, and I did result equals false, this would actually result in true, even though result is equal to 0. And the reason being is that JavaScript interprets certain values and they will cross over the data type. And so a 0 it can also be used to represent a false sometimes. Now, if I did result is triple equals to false, this would evaluate to false because the data type does not match. So what I have here is an integer, which is a whole number input of 0. Down here I have a false, which is called a Boolean value, which is going to be on or off, a true or false value. So because this is an integer and this is Boolean, this evaluates to false. The data type must match for a strict comparison. When possible, it's really nice to use strict equality. I will say that most of your JavaScript will end up working regardless whether you use the regular equality or strict equality, but it is going to be a best practice to use that when possible. I want to take this webinar as an opportunity to highlight that to everybody because I know that we get a lot of questions on that. For the inequality operators, the only one I want to really focus on is this first one, the not equals sign. So this is going to be how you check for inequality, or if two values do not match. So having age set to 20, let me copy this down below again. If I said age is not equal to 25, this would result in true. 20 is not equal to 25. This is going to be a very common operator that you'll use when doing comparisons, again, for condition values. I use this quite frequently, and I wanted to highlight it. I get a lot of people asking me how to do this. They know how to check for equality, but they're not sure how to do inequality. Lastly, at the bottom, we have our logical OR as well as the logical AND operators. These are going to be used to connect two expressions together. Now, the way I like to explain these is through actual sentences. And so if you think about a false evaluation being me telling a lie and a true evaluation being me telling the truth, or more specifically, not lying, then I can give you this example, and it'll illustrate the difference between or as well as and. So right now, today is Thursday where I am. It's a beautiful day outside. It's nice and sunny. So if I said the statement, today is Thursday or it's raining, the first portion is true. Today is Thursday. However, the second portion is not true because it is not raining. By using the word or in between there, though, my sentence is still true. I did not lie, even though both statements were not true. Saying today is Thursday or it's raining means only one of the two has to be true in order for my statement to be confirmed. Now, on the other hand, if I said today is Thursday and it's raining, now I've told a lie because both statements were not true. And so that's the distinction between these two logical operators. If you have two conditions connected with the or, only one of them needs to be true in order for the overall expression to be true. If you have two conditions connected with the and operator, then both need to be true in order for your overall expression to evaluate to be true. This is going to be very useful when you write more complex condition values as well as complex client validation. You want to make sure that you understand the difference between these two logical operators and know when to use them. Barrett, before I transition and start talking about subforms a little bit, I want to check in with you again to see if there are any questions I could answer.
No, I think you're doing pretty well here. I've responded to the questions that have come in, but a lot of them are just about these operators, but they're all good now.
All right, awesome, thanks. And I do want to note that when you get a copy of these presentation materials and you check them out on Zerion Academy, these are going to be links to W3 Schools, which is a really fantastic resource for learning about JavaScript. And so these will bring you to this page here, which is an operator's reference. And I use these quite frequently, actually. So now I want to transition and talk about subforms. And I'm going to take a minute here before I get into the JavaScript related to subforms to discuss kind of how subforms are organized and the structure around the data itself. So you'll see quite frequently in our literature as well as our trainings that we refer to forms and subforms as parent forms and child forms. And so if you think about the parent being the top level, this form is going to have its own properties, its own elements, but then it may include a subform within it, and that would be a child record. Now, if I have a subform, that means that I have now I have children. Now you could have a single paging subform, which is only one child, or you could have a multiple paging subform, which could be one or it could be many children. Now what's important to understand is that when you fill out a subform multiple times, or even just once, there's always an inherent order. So even if you only have one child, you would still refer to that child as your first child. There's an ordering there. Now if you have 3 children like I have in this image here, you could refer to them as my first child, my second child, or my third child. Again, going back to that idea of an ordering existing. Subforms work the same way. What you're going to have instead of a numeric child 1, child 2, child 3 is you're going to have what's called an index. And an index actually goes inside of these accessor square brackets. So you're saying for my children, access the first one. For my children, access the second one, and so on. The way this looks like is as follows. If you have your parent form, and within that parent form, you now have a subform. These are going to be your children. By using the 0 inside of the square bracket accessor operator, you would be able to point to the first child that you had. Using the number 1, you would point to the second child. Using the number 2, you'd point to the third child. The first thing to highlight here is that your ordering starts at the number 0. It does not start with 1, and just throws people off a lot of the time because you have an offset. So what we say is that subforms or arrays are 0-based, meaning that the first entry in the subform is going to have an index of 0. Now, how do you incorporate these into your forms? If I wanted to get the value of my first child's name, so Chuck in this case, I would use my parent form name, dot, again, the accessor property, my subform name, children. Inside of my subform, I would access the first record, and inside that first record, I would access the child name element, which would return Chuck to me. Now, this is going to be useful when you're passing data from a subform up to a parent form, or even vice versa sometimes. Sometimes you may be going from a child form to a grandchild form, and in that scenario, it can become a little bit complex. Just know that the structure of the data, how you branch through, is going to be the same. It's just expanded. It's a little bit longer. Now, down below, I have this next example. The beginning is the same, parent.children, but inside the square brackets, you'll notice that I don't have a number right away. Instead, I'm going to say parent.children.length. Now, we talked about the iForm builder built-in variables or built-in values earlier. When you have a subform, it's going to have built-in values as well, built-in properties. One of note is the .length. .length is going to return the number of records inside of your subform. So in this scenario, I have 3 records. Parent.children.length is going to be equivalent to the number 3. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this with the number 3. So now it's saying what position in the subform am I accessing? Well, we have to do some arithmetic. It's 3 minus 1, which is going to equal 2. And so I'm looking at this record inside of my subform, accessing the property child name, which would give me Morgan. So that's how we're going to take this more complex piece of JavaScript and start doing substitutions with the values manually to be able to trace through what's happening here. Now, this is a really useful piece of code, this little snippet here, the parent.children.length minus 1. This is always going to give you the last record inside of a subform, and sometimes that can be useful. Similarly, parent.children0 is going to give you the first record. And if you wanted to get at something in between, then you would need to have a dynamic way of figuring out what the index value is going to be. Sometimes we'll see other groups go ahead and loop through a subform. And that's something that is going to be a little bit outside the scope of this webinar today, because handling loops is going to be a bit more of an advanced JavaScript topic. But if you want more information on that, you can visit the Customer Success Center. Actually, last webinar I did on debugging forms, I also included a section where I wrote a small function that included a loop that went through subforms. So if you want to check that out, it'll be a good opportunity for you to look at how to access values in the middle of a subform. Moving forward, I now want to start and transition into talking about functions. Functions is a word that you'll see thrown around on the Customer Success Center. You'll hear it on webinars, and you'll hear it from different external resources you look up. And it's a bit of an ambiguous term. A lot of people don't understand what it means when you say write a function or use a function. So the first thing I want to do is take away the programming language, take away what you're trying to accomplish, and just look at functions from a very, very high level. At its core, a function is going to have 3 different pieces. It's going to have inputs, instructions, and then outputs. So the way this works is, if you think about your function as a machine, you need to give the machine something to work with. Once you give it those appropriate values or those appropriate things that it needs to do work, it's going to have a set of instructions that are predefined. It'll take those inputs, run through the instructions, and normally you have something at the end of the function that is going to be output. Now what's important to know is that this function, this is the only way you can get things into the function, and this is the only way you can get things out of the function. So everything else in the middle is not necessarily accessible. So if you think about any time you send out something to be done at work, the example I always use is my taxes, because I don't do my own taxes. So I take my documents that are required from my accountant and I send those to her. So those are my inputs. Now, her process, her instructions, I don't know exactly what she does. And quite honestly, it doesn't matter. That's one of the nice things about functions is you're focused on inputs and outputs. But what I do know with certainty is that from the information I give her, as long as my inputs are valid, I'm going to get my tax return as an output at the end of the day. And so those are your three core components of a function. Now that we've talked about them in a context that is removed from programming, what I want to do next is go ahead and overlay that with some terminology that you'll see in programming languages, not only JavaScript, but any language really. So from here, we'll start with the instructions. Now, when it comes to defining functions inside of a programming language, that means that you're going to have two primary pieces to those instructions. The first part is the name. And so you have to have an identifier for that function. You need to have a name that you can call it. The second part of the function's instructions are going to be the actual programming statements, which would be what the function does once it is called or once it is invoked. Moving over here to the second column, your inputs are going to be called a parameter list. And so think of these as a list of variables that are going to be used inside of the function. It's really important to note that these functions, these inputs and variables are local, meaning that they only exist inside of the function. They actually don't exist outside of the function. And then finally, for output, you're going to have what's called a function's return. So this is an important key word. The return is going to be the value that is sent out of the function. Normally, the return is going to be the result of some sort of manipulation or some sort of a calculation. And I'm going to illustrate all three of these pieces for you now with a sample function that's very, very basic, but also has each of these three components to them. So here I have a very simple function that is going to return to me the area of a rectangle. Now, going up to the top with my definition, this is going to be where my instructions are. You'll notice that I have a name for my function, which is calc area. My inputs are going to be x and y. So these are variable names. Now these don't have any values yet, and that's because they're placeholders for now. Your inputs or your parameter list is going to be placeholder variables. You'll notice I have a set of instructions here. I define a variable called area, and then I assign the product or the multiplication of x and y. So I take x, multiply it by y, assign that to area, and then finally I have my output where I return area. Now if you write this, you put this function in page level JavaScript on your form, then in a number element or a text element inside of your form, you put this in the dynamic value, you would end up with the result 55 because it's going to take 5, assign it to x, 11, map it to y, it'll do that multiplication, and then it'll return the result. By putting this in the dynamic value, that would then show on your device for that element. Now, if we take this another step further, you're also able to not only use literal values, so the actual number 5, but I may want to use a variable or a data column name here. So imagine if I have another element above in my form, and we'll call it, we'll just call this boundary x and boundary y. Now I know that this is running over a little bit, so let me pull this out. What would happen is it would take the value from this element, and again, map to x, take the value from this element, and again map it to y, do the calculation, return that calculation, and assign it to the data column or the element that this is in for the dynamic value. Okay. Now I know again functions is a bit of a complex topic. It's very easy to initially explain, but then what happens is working with functions is going to expand pretty dramatically, and it really allows you to do a lot of different things. For the 33% of people who responded that they work with page-level JavaScript, I'm sure you're fully aware of this already. For those of you who work only in smart controls, know that writing these custom functions is going to allow you to do a couple of different things. The first thing it's going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to write functions or code or instructions that can be used across multiple elements. So if you have a calculation that you need to do in more than one element, you may want to write a function for that calculation so you then don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. Now you may say it's pretty easy to write that function or the instructions inside of the one element and copy and paste it. And it's true, it's not that bad to copy and paste. But normally what happens is the frustration comes in later on once you make updates to your form. Then you have to go through and look for all the different places where you have those instructions and copy and paste the modified value in. If you centralize those instructions into a function, you only have one area where you need to change it because the function call down below should not change. The other thing it's going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to perform very complex calculations that would take up too much space to be done inside of the dynamic value text area. I have a function that I wrote inside of a form that calculates the distance between two lat long coordinates, but the mathematical calculation is pretty extensive, and so I needed to put that inside of a page level JavaScript function because it did not fit in my dynamic value. So that's another example. Barrett, again, I want to check in. I'm going to be talking about some common JavaScript functions next, but before I did that, I want to clear up any confusion or answer any questions I'd be able to.
So far, I think it's pretty good. Just some of the questions were looking for more examples, but I've pointed them in some other directions.
Awesome. And I will say, actually, I was going to hold it till the very end, but I can say it now. I do have a form that I built out that is going to illustrate everything I've talked about today during the webinar. I didn't go through the process of building the form for everybody on the broadcast because we wouldn't have had enough time, but I will be putting up that form package for you all to download and take a look at and use as a launching point to practice these techniques also. So now let's talk about some common JavaScript functions that you may be using inside of your forms, or if you're not using them, these are things that you may be able to take advantage of that will help you with your form building. The first one is going to be the length function. And again, going back to the distinction between functions and variables, .length is actually a property or a variable, but I'm going to throw it under here for common functions because we use it so extensively for subforms. Now, if X is going to be my data column name, then I'm going to say .length to output the number of characters in the text element or the number of records in that array. So for example, if I wanted to check how long my text element was, in a second element, I could put this in as the dynamic value, the data column name of the first element .length, and that would be returned to me. Similarly, if you want to do the same thing with a subform, you can do that too. You would have the parent form name subform data column name .length, and that would return the number of records inside of the subform that you filled out. So you want to use .length whenever you're working with text elements to figure out how long it is, as well as working with subforms. A nice technique that we see used pretty frequently is you can check the length of a text element to see if it's been filled in. So if you have client validation saying, hey, I want to make sure this text element is filled in a certain way, you can always use the .length to ensure that. The next function that I wanted to show you all and to highlight is the index of function. Now, real quickly, I want to jump down to the use with, because you'll see that we use this with multi-select elements. That's going to be a very, very important one. And the way index of works is it's going to be given a value. So this is my input, the value I want to search for. And the output, or the return, is going to be the position that it was found inside of the multi-select or inside of a text element. If it's not found, it's going to give you a -1. And so this is a very important value to keep in mind, because that's what you want to use when you do your comparisons, when you do your inequality checks. The third function I have here is toFixed. Now, I'm putting this in here because I know that this is one that people commonly use. More importantly, it's one that I know people commonly stumble with. Now, the context of using this function is you have a number, a numeric input, and you want to round it to a certain number of decimal points. Well, if I have a number and I round it, the presumption is that my output is a number as well. And that's not actually true with this function. You'll see here in the output, it says it outputs a string with a rounded decimal. The takeaway is that if you're using this inside of an element, you cannot use a number element or it will not work. You have to use a text element or a text-based element with toFixed. So that's a common misconception we see people make, where they'll say number element, and in the bottom one they'll say, dot toFixed 2, round to 2 decimal points. But then that doesn't work correctly. It gives you a 0, is what a lot of you have probably seen or experienced in the past. And that is because the output is actually a string or character data, which cannot be rendered and displayed in a number element. Now, you want to use toFixed anytime you're working with formulas that may have long decimal values from division, or anytime you're working with currency, if you want to round it so that the currency matches the schema, you can't have half a penny. Or sometimes if you're working with percentages, you're also going to want to be able to round those numbers off appropriately. Now, the final function I have listed for everyone here is actually a function that does something similar to the toFixed function, but in this scenario, instead of rounding, it's actually going to truncate or round down to the nearest whole number. So what I have here is capital M math.floor, and then inside of the parentheses, you would give the numeric value. You could put a literal value here, or you could use a data column name, which is what I'm going to show you in a little bit. The output you would get is a number where the value is rounded down to the nearest whole number. So if I put in 3.14 and then I run the math.floor function, I would only get 3, no decimal points. You'll want to use these with calculations as well. Sometimes if you're doing some sort of accounting calculation and you only want to grab whole values, you'll use math.floor to remove that decimal or that partial calculation. Now, Barrett, I'm going to go ahead and load up the form that I've built for everybody. While I do that, would I be able to answer any questions?
Not yet, but would you like me to launch the poll right now?
Yeah, that would be really good.
All right, so while everyone is waiting for John to show the form, if you could take a minute to just respond to this quick poll on what you're feeling more comfortable with after today's session. You can do one or more of these selections. So if you're feeling more comfortable with everything on this list, feel free to select all of them. All right, John, we have about half of our audience has responded, so let's just give it another few seconds.
Sounds good.
Okay, so with that, John, we've got some good responses. It looks like the major response that we're getting is that people are feeling more comfortable with using native JavaScript functions. The other ones are also responded to, but just not as extreme with the amount of responses.
Sounds good.
So I'll go ahead and close the poll.
All right. Okay, so I have the form loaded up. You'll notice in the background of my screen I have it loaded up in Form Builder as well, and I'm going to talk through what I wrote inside of the Form Builder after I show you how this form works. So I have 3 sections to this form. The first section, I have a text element, and then as I enter values in here, so I'm going to say, thank you for joining the webinar. Underneath, you'll see that there is a element for the length, and it's going to return 33. That's an example of using the .length property, or the .length variable. So what that means is that there are 33 characters inside of my text element above. Now underneath that, you'll see there's a keyword search for the word Zerion. That's using the index of function. Right now, because the word Zerion is not inside of my text element, it's returning a -1. But as soon as I add to this, whoops, there we go. Oh, it's reaching the end of the character limit is what's going on. And I misspelled it, of course. Let's just do that. You'll see that this returns the number 39. And that's because the beginning of the match, the Z, is at the character number 39. So this would be 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44. Now the index of is also going to start at 0, so that means that the total length is actually 45. If I move where it finds the word Zerion, then you'll see that the number also is affected. So if I do this, now my keyword search is at 0. 0 is going to be the smallest number that you can get with the index of where it is true. The reason I want to highlight this is if you're working with a multi-select and you're searching for a particular value, you want to see if that value is greater than or equal to 0. If it's greater than or equal to 0, then the expression effectively states that it found the match in the multi-select. Moving on down, I have an element where I can enter a number. I'm just going to enter in a random number here. And then these 2 elements below are going to be examples of using toFixed as well as math.floor. So you'll see for rounded to 2 decimals, it's going to take that 5.875 and it actually rounds it to 5.88. So that's an important aspect of toFixed. You want to know that it's going to do that for you. Underneath, where I use math.floor, it's going to round that down to 5, so it gets rid of all the decimal points. And then finally, down below here, I do have a subform called employees. And I'm just going to go ahead and enter in some quick names here. I'm going to use my name first. Then I'm going to add another employee. Barrett. And then we'll do one more. And what I have is 3 elements down below. The first one is going to return the length of the subform to me. So if there's 3 records, then it's going to give me the number 3. And that's using the .length property again. So you have an example of using .length up here with the text element, as well as down here with a subform. First employee is going to return the first subform records value for employee name, which is John. And then last employee is an example of what I showed you in the slides earlier, where I'm always going to return the bottom subform record. So the most recently filled out one.
So John, earlier today, someone had a question of seeing an example of how you pass the data from a subform record into the parent form. And where you did that here with the first employee name, do you want to show what that looks like?
Yep, that was what I was going to do in the last couple minutes of this webinar, was go through the actual form structure.
Perfect, then I won't stop you.
So actually, let me do this. Let me move this over a little bit. So hopefully we can see both, and I can scroll here. This is fantastic. Okay. So, and I don't think I have any condition values, so I can hide that column too. If any of you all are wondering about this view that I'm using, normally when you load up the form builder, you see this device view. It actually looks like this with the sidebar. I like to go up here and click on this table view, especially when I work with smart controls, because I'm able to control the columns that are shown. So we'll start off at the top here. You'll see this text element has a dynamic value where I am defaulting it to an empty string. This is going to resolve caching issues you may have, where sometimes you submit a record and then the next time you open up that form, you have that record being used in calculations in the new form. And what this does is it's going to default this to be empty. Any sort of smart controls that use that data column are then going to have that empty value to start off with. So this is again going back to the operators, an example of the assignment operator. Underneath, you'll see I use the data column name of this element dot length. And so that is going to be an example of that property. Then we have the data column name again, tweet dot index of, and then in parentheses, I have the string Zerion. So that's my input. That's what I'm searching for. Again, if it's found, it's going to return the position in the string that it was found at. Moving on down, in my enter number element, you'll notice I default this to 0. Again, that's to resolve caching issues. And underneath, you'll see I use enter underscore number dot to fixed 2, because I want to round it to 2 decimal points. Again, reiterating, the important thing here is that I made this a text element, even though it looks like a number. And that is because of the return value you get from the toFixed function. So if you've ever tried to use that and you've run into this error, that's what you need to do to fix it, is to use a text element. Next, I have an example of math.floor, where I'm going to pass in the data column name of my number element, and it's going to truncate or remove all the decimal points from that value. Lastly, moving down to the bottom, these are probably the ones that people are most interested in because they're most complicated. I'm going to actually take these and I'm going to paste them in this text editor because it's a little bit easier to see. So what I have is, for the subform length, I'm going to use my parent form name, the subform's data column name, and then dot length. Now, if I want to pass a value from the subform back up to the parent, then what you're going to see is a dynamic value that looks like this. What I have here is, again, the parent form name, the subform name, and then inside of that subform, I'm going to access, again, the accessor operator. I'm going to access the first record in my subform, and then in that first record, I'm going to access employee name, which is the data column name inside of that subform. So this is an example of taking a subform value and passing it to the parent. Or more precisely, actually, this is an example of retrieving a subform value from the parent. And then at the last one here at the bottom, this one is going to be a little bit longer. But what I'm doing is I'm taking the parent form name dot subform, and then instead of using a static or a literal accessor, I'm going to have this inside of my square brackets, and I'm going to take this and deconstruct it. And then dot employee name. So what I have is common JavaScript and form building dot employees dot length -1. And so again, as I filled out 3 records, this ends up being the value 3. So what I can do is underneath this, I can say 3 - 1, and that ends up being the value 2. If I go back to my form, I'm going to look at the record that has an index of 2, 0, 1, 2, and grab employee name. And that's why this shows here. If I were to add a 4th employee, then you'll see that last employee updates at the bottom with Mark. Okay. Barrett, did any questions come up while I was going through the form and explaining the Smart Controls forum as well?
There was a question about using your option list statement, if you would use it in multi-select, pick list, as well as select option list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you could do, for multi-select, you're going to want to use index of. For a select or a pick list, because you're only getting one value, you're going to want to use the comparison operator, so the double equal sign or the triple equal sign. And what I would recommend doing is using that with the ZC display key or ZC display value, so that you're not using the sort order. And the primary reason for that is because you can rearrange the options, the arrangement of the options, and that would affect your smart controls or your JavaScript that you wrote based on a particular arrangement of the options that you had at the onset. Okay.
Great, thank you, John.
Yep, any other questions?
Not at the moment. And
Okay.
since we're getting towards the end, I don't think so, but I'll let you know if anything comes up.
Perfect. Well, in that case, I just want to go ahead and thank everybody for attending this webinar. I want to make sure that everyone knows that we are here for you guys. The entire purpose of doing these webinars is to help extend knowledge and help support our customer base. And so some of the ways that we're able to do that, in addition to the webinars, is to visit the Customer Success Center. We do offer certifications in form buildings, which is going to pertain to what I talked about today. And then we also have the ability to work with you guys on a project level. So we do have project services. And what I would definitely recommend is partaking in our community and following our release notes as well, because that's going to keep you up to date on all the newest things that are happening at Zerion. As Barrett said at the beginning of this broadcast, you are going to receive these things in the next 48 hours. If you don't have access to Zerion Academy already, then you will be given and created and given a username and login information for that. Inside of Zerion Academy, you're also going to be able to access the recording of this session, a copy of the PDFs from this session, and then I will have this form package that I built for you in there as a downloadable link as well. And Barrett, I did see one question pop up while I was wrapping everything up. Would I be able to answer that?
Nope, they were just saying they were looking into it more.
Okay, cool, sounds good. Well, in that case, everyone, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we will talk to you either if we see you at the Power Summit, that would be great, and if we don't, then we'll talk to you next webinar. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great, thanks, John.